Hi, welcome everybody. We've got a really fascinating topic today. Fascinating, a little hard to talk about maybe, but today's episode is about aging parents. Because Cristie, you and I are both at the age right now where you've dealt with far more than I have with your dad just passing. But we're going to dive into aging parents and then where it shifts over to parenting your parents. And just, we know you and I and so many of our friends, we're just in that season of life where we're having to talk about it.
And just really going through that process. And honestly, as we've been talking about it, I could feel my anxiety levels just start to go up.
I know.
Because it's all the things that you don't know and all the things that you're aware of, but maybe you haven't put any focus on. And so you start to get a little overwhelmed by the stuff you still have to do and put in place.
Yes. So today we're just going to talk about really the tip of the iceberg, because there is so much information out there, so many resources, and we're only going to speak to it from our perspective. We are by no means experts on this topic other than our personal experiences, and everybody has a different experience. So what we wanted to start off with is that question is, where do you start? At what point, what age, where do you even start having the conversation with your parents or your siblings? And I'll just kind of start with this, and I want you to fill this in too. I think the first thing that you have to think about is just simply starting off with a conversation with your parents of, hey, have you ever thought about it? And I think it could be at any age. I don't think it's ever too soon. I think sometimes we get the false impression if our parents are super active because people are living longer. They're super sharp, they're active, they could be 85 years old and they're like, God, they're doing awesome. And you don't think to ask the question of, and what I would say the questions are first off, what are your wishes? Have they thought about it? What if you need in-home health care? What if you need to go into a home? Do you want... it depends all financially too, where they're at. But I think it's just really about having that conversation first and sitting down with your parents and starting to talk about it, because it's not always easy.
No. And I think, in some cases, your parents are uncomfortable talking about it. And they also might be a little hesitant to share all of the situations in terms of their finances and what they've done or what they haven't done. And, my experience was with my dad and his wife. And we did have the conversation about what their will looked like and what their trust looked like. But the reality was it didn't happen until after my dad had already gone into hospice.
Oh, wow.
And so we were kind of behind the eight ball on it. Fortunately, after he had, they had put him in hospice and had only given him maybe 24 hours, he bounced back. And fortunately, we were able to have some more time with him, but we took advantage of, we didn't know how long we had, but we did take advantage of making sure that we had some things set up, which was the will and the trust and the executor. And it was tough. It was tough on them because the reality was a little bit more real than when you're just kind of having that conversation, like you mentioned, as hopefully earlier on. It was tough for us having to really outline what some of the things were going to look like and who was going to be the executor.
Yeah.
In this case, some cases are, most obviously they're different. Maybe there's not a lot financially that you have to worry about. Maybe they don't own a home. My mom does not own a home. So that will be a very different situation. But in this case, there are some things, and there are 6 beneficiaries. And so it gets a little bit more complicated, and the dynamics of the siblings or the beneficiaries, when you think that everybody's okay and they're doing fine and no one's going to have an issue, once you have to have those tough conversations, my experience has been 9 times out of 10, it can get pretty difficult between the siblings or the beneficiaries. And so if the parents can have a plan so that they can prevent that.
It's super important.
And when you kind of communicate it to them that way, your question was, when should you have the conversation and how should you approach it? I think if you can come from a place of, this is going to prevent the drama, the chance of there being bitterness, outbursts, whatever that is between, your children, that is the ultimate goal. And then, of course, the person that's going to be the executor and relieving them of the stress and the burden that would come along with that.
Yeah.
Because that is a real thing.
Oh, for sure. And I did this with my parents about, and I have a stepfather, and that's what I would highly recommend. So exactly to your point, they don't have a lot of wealth, but my whole motivation was, I want to carry out your wishes. I'm kind of the main contact, me and my older brother, but I want to carry out your wishes. This is not about just to make sure that whoever you want to get X gets it. And there's no question on if I'm doing the right thing or my brother's doing the right thing. And so I think those are the first questions. But along with that, what we did is we also recorded a conversation. This was super eye-opening, but Scott recorded the conversation when I was asking them, I've never asked you. So they have burial plots, but I've never asked them. My mom is not a religious person, but have you ever thought what you want? Do you want a funeral? Do you want a life celebration? What flowers do you want? What do you want it to look like? And it got really emotional because she told me a song that she wants played.
Oh, wow.
She told me her flowers. She told me, and she kind of wants a combination, but she said, I never really thought about that. But I think that is really important to ask those questions so that we can honor them the best that we can.
And hopefully they are in the position that they can have a plan in place. My dad and his wife had already paid for their cremation. They had already set all of that up. So that made it less work for us. But that's not always the situation. But if you can at least have an outline of what they hope to have. And then, the next conversation, I think that we're getting to, the will's important, the trust is important for in the event that they pass.
Yeah.
But what are the plans as they're aging?
Yes.
And when they can no longer take care of themselves?
Yeah.
And then you're starting to see their health maybe deteriorate and whatever that looks like. And I think that's something that we don't talk about. What is our plan for that? We talk about when they die.
Yeah.
But hopefully they're going to live longer. But what does that look like? And how does that impact us?
Well, that's huge because we all have, I've thought about it. We've talked about it. And I definitely want to set it up to where I don't put the burden on my children. But I think for our parents' generation, I don't think they really ever talked about it as much. But yeah, you're right. Asking them, most people don't want to go into a home.
Right.
If they can avoid it. But there are cases, which I know we have many friends that have went through this, where now there's independent living, but there's assisted living, but some people are in their home and they just don't want to leave. And so the family is now taking on this burden of how financially can we have somebody come in and help or not? And it's a strain on family members.
Well, and I'm in the thick of that right now.
Yeah.
So my dad passes away. And the conversations we were having with his wife, Loretta, she's 81. And the conversations were that she wanted to go into assisted living. Her parents had gone into assisted living and they thrived on it. Fortunately, they could afford a nice facility. Yes. And, Loretta's in a position where she could as well. So that was the plan. We thought we would have some time to kind of wrap up what we needed to do financially with her estate and my dad's estate. And then we would take at least maybe 6 months, 3 to 6 months and get her, settled. And then we would start looking at centers. Well, within 30 days, she changed her mind. And there were outside influences that had convinced her she just needed to stay in her house.
Yeah.
Totally outside of the children that are there having to, that are supporting and trying to help her navigate being alone and her being able to be driven to doctor's appointments, driven to the grocery store, all of these things that we don't think about. And she is convinced that she's going to stay in her house.
Yeah.
And so we're all trying to be supportive of that, but also be realistic.
Yeah.
And how long can that continue?
Yeah.
The children are all, 3 of us are out of state. And then there are other family members that are there. They're in their 40s, early 50s that are, busy, careers, children, all of those things. And so it does bring on challenges that, if we could have had a better plan, maybe we could have navigated that a little differently.
And I think it's hard for them to really think about it. You don't know how you're going to be. And that's why I think having the conversation up front is so critical, because even if financially they can afford anything they want, it's still communicating to the children what their wishes are, because you're trying to honor her wishes. But
Correct.
You got to talk about the financial aspect of can we do it? Can you do it? And then you have the flip side. So I'm going into that. There is sometimes that shift too of they're mentally great. There's clarity. There's no problem. They can articulate their wishes and their desires. And you want to have that conversation while they're there. But if that shifts, and as we have kind of seen, your roles start shifting from, just honoring their wishes to you start becoming the parent a little bit. So you start parenting your parents. If you have to start going to doctor's appointments, they don't really remember what's going on, or medically, just depends on where they're at. It changes your role.
It does. And having an executor, in this case, I'm the executor of Loretta and the estate. And it's a tough role.
Yeah.
Because you do want to honor their wishes, and you also want to make sure that you're paying attention to the rest of the family that has an opinion or a say, and so collectively you're coming together trying to make sure that you're respecting all of it. And so it can be a tough position, but making sure that you have the right person in place that can handle that. And hopefully, the parent is still aware.
Yeah.
We're in a good place. We're seeing little signs of things, but that could just be grief. So we're not quite certain what that looks like. I will say that, we talked about checking accounts and getting on their accounts just to make sure that it's safe, that they're, you hear so many stories where money gets spent, someone comes in, convinces them to invest or borrow or whatever that looks like.
Right.
And that's something I just had not even thought about. And we did actually take those steps, but it was so outside of my even thought process that this would be what we would be doing today.
Yeah.
That these are things that I would have to be thinking about and considering.
Right.
And it's overwhelming and it's a lot, but if you're prepared and are having those conversations with your parents, you're doing your research, there's a lot of information out there to kind of help you navigate that, because it is overwhelming.
Yeah. So just to kind of recap just really quickly on the first part of, where do you even start? It's first having that conversation when they're in a great position to have that conversation. Where are they financially? A lot of times we just don't know. And I think the second step is really knowing when you need to intervene and when is that. And you just touched on being on bank accounts and all of that. And I think helping them gather their information depends on what time of life they're at, right? Helping them gather their birth certificates, their bank accounts, becoming a signer on their bank accounts, all of that. When they know what they're doing and they feel good about it, and hopefully you've encouraged them to do a trust and take care of all that. But then there's the second step as things start shifting, is knowing when to intervene. How do you know when to intervene? Because I think what comes with that is you've got siblings. I feel like you got to set expectations with everybody of who's going to do what, because it all of a sudden can be, if something happens suddenly, it becomes very overwhelming. I mean, you moved to Idaho.
Right.
And was trying to work, and that's
all
lot.
of it. And it was overwhelming. And I have a brother that lives in Canada. So of course that wasn't realistic for him to be there. My sister lives in Utah, and she had things that were, preventing her from being there. So what we've tried to do, and I've witnessed this with other families, which I think is so beautiful when this works. I've witnessed where there's multiple siblings and they take shifts. Each one commits to when they're living in the home until they have to make that decision to make a change. But while they're living in the home, they have, one sibling does Monday, Wednesday, Friday, another does Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and they alternate and are able to manage it. And that helps them to keep them in the home longer, which I think is ultimately the best case scenario, if that works and it's not taking too much of it time on the siblings that are doing it. So in our case, we have 3 siblings all live out of state.
Yeah.
And we have her nieces that have really jumped in and helped and been committed to helping and doing basically that, alternating days. But there will be a time when that won't work. And then also as she's aging and observing the changes that are happening and recognizing when is it going to be the time. And I've seen that play out really sadly as well. I have a friend who went through that with her father, and when they made the decision that they could no longer, they did it for 2 years where they alternated their shifts, and it was draining on them.
Yeah.
I just thought it was so beautiful, the commitment that they had to him, though. And when they finally had to make the decision because it was just too much, and he had changed so much, he was devastated and he was angry, but they had no other choice. And so that whole dynamic makes it difficult to get to that place. And then you feel guilty.
See, and I think that goes back to the conversations too at the beginning because is it realistic? And see, it's a personal thing for everybody. I don't want that to be a burden on my kids. I don't want them to feel like they got to be with me 24/7. And, who knows? We all wish, probably, I think a lot of us wish we're just going to die fast. It's not going to be a big deal. The trust is all set up. That would be the perfect scenario for me. But that's not what the majority of us are dealing with.
Well, and I'll give you another example. My mom is 81 and her financial situation is very different.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see her struggle with certain things. Yeah. Just being able to walk down the stairs and do her laundry. She lives in an apartment complex. And my sister and I are having constant conversations. What is this going to look like? The ability to go into assisted living may not be an option.
Yeah.
Our brother has been a saint and does the majority of the care, but there's going to come a time that we're going to need to have that conversation. And will she live with one of us if that's not an option? And who is that going to be? What is that going to look like? And so it's a lot to take on, but it needs to happen.
Yeah. I would say a lot of things we don't think about too. I know for sure I haven't is when my mom fell and broke her wrist last fall and needed surgery. Then all of a sudden, even though my stepfather is still alive, he is not capable to help her shower or help her, that's a major, and you have surgery and you go right home and jumping in to take care. But it's also, can she get in-home health care? Who do I call? Doctors have to prescribe this. Like there's so much to deal with. And you're like, where do I even start? And that was really hard, communicating with physical therapy. And somebody in the family has to take on that role.
Right.
If one of the others, can't do it, if they're married or whatever. And for your mom being single. So there's a lot there to really think about. And we haven't even talked about the emotional side of all of this and the toll it takes on not only your parents, because think about them. They've been independent. And this is what I try to remember all the time. We've got to show them some love and grace because they've been independent. Now, as the role is shifting, it's easy to come into that parent role and we're parenting our parents and we get frustrated and we get impatient and remembering the strong person that they were. It's a dynamic that we just haven't dealt with.
And they don't want to be a burden.
No.
Ultimately, they don't want to be a burden.
No. So we have done a lot so like we said, we're talking on just the tip of the iceberg of dealing with aging parents. And we're in it. Like all of our friends are in it right now. So if you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, you're dealing with your parents in some capacity or another. And I just highly encourage everybody to just start having the conversation so you can honor their wishes. But we have discovered so many resources, and I really want to share these with you because I think they're powerful. So if you're dealing with that right now, start off with Medicare.gov. Find out the differences between Medicare and Medicaid. Medicaid is for lower income, but what are your options? Do you even know anything about it? And I would highly recommend, as I found an incredible podcast. The podcast is Aging Life with Nancy Oriola. And it's such a great podcast because she started talking about the biggest mistakes with Medicare, but we need to know it in our 60s. On our 64th birthday, we need to know what the differences are. And so I highly recommend going to her podcast as well. There is also usaging.org. One of my favorite websites I found is seniorlifestyle.com. That was a really good website. It had so many different resources on it really dove into caring for your parents at any stage and a ton of resources. There was also a couple of books, Caring for Your Aging Parents. It's a complete guide by AARP, and Elder Care. And then there's an Elder Care Planner by Joy Lovard that you can find on Amazon. So those were all really great resources. But for you and I, being in the thick of it, you more so than I, because what would be your best advice that you could tell our listeners when dealing with this?
Well, I think it's back to what I kind of said earlier. We talked about the will and the trust, but we never had a conversation about what it would look like when they couldn't take care of themselves.
Yeah.
And so that has not been a conversation until now.
Yeah.
And now is a little bit more difficult because we've lost one parent and we're coping through the grieving that she's experiencing on top of the aging and being able to be more independent. And so it's a challenge for us there. So I would say the most important piece is having the conversation about them, what the care will be for their long-term living, and having an outline for that and a plan, because most likely if they're not in a financial position, you're probably going to take on more of a role than you think, whether it's a financial or just the caregiving. And that is something you and your family have to be prepared for.
Yeah.
And so having that now, I think, is best case scenario.
Yeah, I think that is really important. I also think having the conversation with your siblings, maybe that's aside from with your parents, but if you're all sitting down and talking to your parents at a different time, everybody's takeaway is so different. But I think having that conversation, the dialogue with your siblings, and I'm so grateful that I talked my parents into doing a trust, because it just, to your point, it took the pressure off of me. I know that I can just say, this is what they wanted. This is their wishes. It makes it real easy. And then I would also say, I know so many people who have dealt with a parent dying of cancer, or there's some really unfortunate things I know a lot of people have to deal with. And maybe it's heart failure, whatever, and it requires round the clock care. And we touched on it before we started this recording. But there's also a podcast, Tuesday People with Mitch Albom, where he interviewed Maury Schwartz, who was dying of ALS. I never thought about this before, but he did not want his children to be his main caregivers, because he wanted them to come and visit him, not to take care of him, but to love him and have the conversations as a family member, even so much so for his wife. He didn't want his kids trying to bathe him or his wife trying to feed him every meal. He still wanted her to have somewhat of a normal life, all of the people, and he hired it. Now, he was fortunate enough he could do that. But what it said to me is that those were his wishes, not necessarily his family wishes. Those were his wishes, because he wanted his memories. He wanted his kids and his wife and his close friends' memories to be the time they spent together, not I had to bathe them. I had to. And I just had never thought about it before. I thought it was so
beautiful.
Loving.
I think it's beautiful, and it's a blessing that he was able to do that.
Yeah.
I think, there's the other side we talked about where some of the family members will, probably be pretty adamant. No, I'm not having someone else take care of my dad or my mom.
Yes.
I am going to do the care.
Yeah.
And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
If it's long term and you're talking 10 years, 5 years, even a couple of years can be a lot for someone. So hopefully, you are able to, have a backup plan, because it can be very wearing on the relationship. It can be very wearing on you and your spouse. If you're married, your family, everyone involved.
So my recommendation is, during this season of life that is new, there's always chapters, is being patient, but really starting a conversation. I don't care how healthy your parents are, how sharp they are. Do you know their wishes? Because it could happen at any time.
Yes.
I mean, it can happen in their 60s. It can happen in their 70s. And we hope that they live forever, for a long time. But having the conversation, I feel so much better knowing I will carry out their wishes more than anything. But it doesn't make it easier. And give yourself some grace and patience, and with your siblings and yourself, because it's a lot to take on.
And we will have all of these resources in our show notes, but also listed on our website.
Yes. Yes. So thank you, everyone. This has been a deep topic. We would love any feedback that you have or what you might be dealing with. Because like I said, we just touched the tip of the iceberg. There's millions of different scenarios out there, but it's an important topic. So thanks, everyone.